I wanted to thank you all for joining me. I live up here in Franklin County, and we are kind of starting the process of the map updates. FEMA's doing map updates around the state, and our region is kind of leading the pack. We have a few other spots in the state where like 1 or 2 towns might be going forward through this process. So we're lucky we get to lead the process. But one of the nice things is that we'll end up with FEMA digital maps, which is a little bit easier for any of you who have used flood maps before. We have a small group. I don't know if we want to go around, just say the town that you're with, and if you want to do that quick, just the town that you're with and maybe what your role is at your town, so I can make sure I'm getting your questions.
So why don't we start with Susan? We can go around.
Hi, I'm Susan Arguin. I am the new town administrator for the town of South Hero.
Mike, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well, Greta. Mike Curtis, North Hero. I'm on the new member of the Planning Commission.
All right. Andy
Alling, also on the North Hero Planning Commission.
Okay. Mike Johnston.
Mike Johnston, NRPC staff, and also the zoning administrator for Highgate and Sheldon.
David.
Yes, Planning Commission, North Hero, David Berenberg.
Lisa
Faring, DRB, North Hero.
Amy
Drew, zoning administrator.
and Emily. Maybe she's not hearing us. Emily Clark is the Planning Commission chair in Grand Isle.
Well, thank you all. I'm like, normally I wouldn't do that with a large group because it takes like 25 minutes, but I figured we have good representation from North Hero today, which is great. That's great to see. Great to hear. So I'm going to share my screen, and if you can't see or if something's not coming through, just let me know. There we go. Can everyone see that? Good?
Yes,
Good.
I can see it.
Okay. So there we go. For tonight, what we'll plan to do is kind of 3 areas that we'll talk about. The whole idea is helping to get our towns all ready for the new flood maps, and also just to revisit and look at what your flood regulations are. So we'll talk a little bit about the map update process, your regulations, your bylaw update process, and then what some of the state model language includes. There we go. So for Franklin and Grand Isle counties, we have 4 main watersheds that FEMA's looking at. We're a little bit unique now. FEMA does their mapping, their flood mapping by watersheds, but for us, we were the beginning of this process. And so FEMA actually did updates with all of Franklin County all at once, all of Orleans County all at once, and then Grand Isle with Lake Champlain. They've kind of sped Lake Champlain up to catch up so that we can have Franklin, Orleans, and Grand Isle counties going forward, kind of at the front of the pack. So most of Franklin County was the Missisquoi River remapping update effort. It had a little bit of the Lamoille River, which was included in the southern part of our county, and then the little tiny bit of the Richelieu, which I think is probably just going to be absorbed with the Lake Champlain mapping. And so when we look at FEMA maps are geared towards helping to show inundation flooding hazards. So inundation flooding is when the water comes up and floods out onto the big broad floodplains. This was right after Tropical Storm Irene at the I-89, the Richmond Park and Ride, right off the interstate there. So Colchester Point 2011 up here, I think, was a much bigger flood than it was that Irene was. And I'm sure all of you remember that if you were around and lived here at the time, like you remember the lake flooding all spring in 2011 as well. So that's the type of inundation flooding, that kind of big broad-based flooding. And we experience it all over the state. It's not just on the lake. It's not just on the really big rivers. And, you know, floodplains are important parts of our communities. Floodplains are areas where the water spreads out, slows down. It helps to allow nutrients, all the material, the dirt and silt and sediment and the rocks and debris and trees and everything that comes down with floodwater. It allows it to slow down and fall out of the water. You know, up here, one of the big focuses, I think in a lot of the community discussions has been on water quality. And this is a key piece of that discussion, water quality. When we have floodplains where the water is able to access the land and flood, and we don't have houses in that area, then it allows all that sediment and nutrients that we're trying to keep out of Lake Champlain. It keeps it on the farm fields, helps to recharge the soils on the farm fields, and it keeps it from going into the lake. So this is an example in Irene. The Otter Creek flows flows from the south
It's all flooding.
and Rutland all the way up through Middlebury out to the lake. And in between Rutland and Middlebury, if you've ever driven like Route 7, you'll see those large, huge farm field floodplains along the Otter Creek. And this is an example here where Rutland, so the water came down out of the mountains, flowed into Rutland, and this is how much water was flowing in Irene. You can see up here in Rutland, the peak, kind of from the baseline to the peak was pretty substantial. And by having all of these, I'm pointing to my screen, you can't see that, but by having all of these, hopefully you'll see my pointer, all the floodplains between Rutland and Middlebury, you can see how much slower it took for the water to reach the lake or to reach the Middlebury gauge, and also the length of time it took and how much less water, how much less of a peak there was, kind of that big, quick, flashy peak. So the floodplains helped to reduce that flashiness, and it helped to allow the water to slow down and access its floodplain in the wetlands. So I think all of us up here probably appreciate the benefits of our floodplains along the lake, along our rivers. It's the areas where our floodwater and debris and ice come out, and they can be stored so they're not going down and knocking into houses. It helps to keep our water clean. Again, a top priority up here in the basin. It helps to enrich our farm soils and our regular soils, recharging water supply. And they're really diverse and productive areas for agriculture, for forestry, for wildlife, and for fisheries. And they tend to be the places where our communities gather. And of course, they help reduce flood levels and flood power. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the FEMA map. So mapping those floodplains is why we're here today talking about this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about FEMA's map update process again, and then I'll talk about what that means for you as towns. So right now, if you're familiar with your FEMA maps, if you've ever seen them, they look kind of like this map on the left-hand side here, probably. This is of the Passumpsic, probably St. Johnsbury. And here is what a newer map looks like. This is Lake Champlain and Burlington right down at the waterfront. So the new maps will be digital. That means that we can see them online on a format like the A&R Natural Resource Atlas. If you have a GIS system in your town office for looking at zoning or flood or zoning maps or something, then you can bring up that map as part of your zoning layer to view it right in your office. So no more looking at these old paper maps that just have roads with no landforms or shapes or houses or anything underneath it. And you're sitting there with someone trying to guess, like, are you in the floodplain? I really have no clue because this map is 35 years old and I can't tell. So again, I mentioned before, Franklin or Orleans County, Lake Champlain watershed, Lamoille watershed. These are all some of the first ones that are coming through. The map update process takes about 3 to 5 years. So FEMA, for us, it's been very elongated because a lot of that happened in the middle of COVID. We had some of our very first meetings, public meetings with folks from FEMA in 2018 or so, 2018, 2019. And then they go off and start making the maps. And a lot of that process has been elongated because I think the delay from the just the COVID delay. I won't go too much into the history of the flood mapping program. I think suffice it to say, these are the old types of flood maps that we first saw in our communities, obviously not very helpful, made a lot of times in the 70s and the 80s. And a lot of our communities are still on paper. So the update to these maps kind of going through, you may have flood maps that look something like the 1, 2, or 3, where we have floodway maps separate from the flood insurance rate maps. These are the maps that FEMA publishes to show those floodplain hazards. The new maps will be both a printed panel and in that digital format that I mentioned. So these digital maps will have the air photo underneath. The mapping is a little bit more user-friendly, I think, than these old maps. In Franklin County, we have one town, we have Montgomery, that actually does have digital maps, but you can see a lot of the northern part of the state is where we're going to see a lot of these first new maps coming out. So again, this is what those new maps, the new map style looks like. This is from our Vermont A&R Natural Resources Atlas. I don't know if anyone's ever used that before, but it can be a helpful tool for planning, like for planning commissions, or if you're looking at for zoning and like in zoning offices. I know that zoning administrators often use this. So you can see some of the different flood zones, and I'll go over some of this. So FEMA maps what they call, well, a lot of people call the 100-year floodplain. FEMA's term for this area is the special flood hazard area. And it's not that the area can only flood once in 100 years. It's that it has a 1% annual chance of flooding. What that means, if you think of a jar of marbles and you have 99 green marbles and 1 blue one for the year that it floods, like what's the chance every year that you pick out that 1 blue marble from the jar? So it's like every year you could pick out that blue marble 2 or 3 years in a row, or you may go a lot longer than 100 tries before you get that flood. So the lake flooding of 2011 was kind of highest recorded lake level. It doesn't mean that we're not going to see another flood on the lake to that extent. The Trout River and the Missisquoi River up in northern Vermont in the late 90s and 98 flood. It doesn't mean that we're not going to see floods on the Trout River again for 100 years. So again, it's just that what's the chance every year that you're going to see a big enough flood like we see on the maps. So these FEMA maps, they show that whole zone that can flood is called the special flood hazard area. That's that zone AE, typically it's called. On bigger rivers like the Missisquoi, the Trout, the Tyler Branch, the Lamoille, you're going to see a more detailed flood map. There's more information because there's more risk, there's more people who live along them. And so this more protected area, the floodplain, is called a floodway. There's the river channel. Sometimes you have, in a lot of our region, our maps are what are called approximate floodplains. That's that zone A down here. It's an area that FEMA doesn't publish as much detailed information, but still indicating that it's a flood zone. And then there's this area kind of here, it's this gray shaded area. That's the 500-year floodplain, kind of a 0.2% annual chance. Again, it's like not that it only floods once in 500 years, but every year, if you're trying, what's your chance that you may have a flood? So it's a very low chance on it from a year-to-year basis, but again, it can happen back to back. So in our area, what does a work map meeting mean? So FEMA creates they get priorities from the towns and from the state, and then they go off and they have their own priorities, and then they go off and hire consultants to create the maps for us. And the first product that comes out is called a work map. It's a map that doesn't have any legal authority to it yet, but they're basically saying this is our first draft of a map. And what do you think? We have stuff that looks obviously wrong, like wrong street names, wrong names of rivers, wrong names of towns. Is Enosburg spelled right? Are we talking about Enosburg Village or Enosburg Town? Is it Alburg Village or Alburg Town? That kind of thing. And then after they had that time for review and input, Then they'll go back and create the more official map, which will then have much more strict timelines to it. And so in Grand Island, Franklin counties, we're looking at those work map, those draft map meetings where FEMA presents those draft maps to us sometime this spring. We were thinking it was going to be April, March, April, and now I've heard it's been pushed back to May. So we're expecting those work map meetings to be announced at some point. Sometimes we don't have a ton of lead time on when they're going to be held, but as soon as we find out, we share that with Greta and the team at NRPC and try to get the word out to all of you as quickly as we can to try to get as many folks there as possible. So the work map meeting is just kind of the official map launch, but it doesn't mean it's your only chance to look at the maps. It's just the first chance to see them and have the folks from FEMA will be there so you can have that conversation or ask questions of them. After that work map meeting, so spring of this year, it starts what we think of as starting this clock for our towns to start updating your regulations and your bylaws. When FEMA creates these new maps and they publish updated flood maps, they require every town in the National Flood Insurance Program to make sure that their flood bylaws, their flood hazard bylaws are up to date and everything is compliant. So sometimes that might mean correcting a few small little mistakes or a few omissions or something. And in some cases, it's like, we're gonna just start from scratch because the last time the flood regulations have been updated were 20 years ago. And there's just enough that there's so much there to need to update. So we're gonna start from scratch. So every town's in a little bit of a different place. So after this spring meeting, we have, typically around 2 years or so to get those regulations ready for when the FEMA maps go effective. So there's a lot going on in this slide. It's really not my favorite slide, but let me just get all these things to come in. So I mentioned a discovery meeting. It's like FEMA's kickoff meeting that happened back in like 2018 or so. We're kind of in this area right here where we're waiting for our work map meeting. We're kind of like halfway down this timeline of the map adoption process. FEMA will have this work map meeting after all the towns have chances to review that. They've had a time to make corrections. They'll publish information about when those maps are going to then become effective. There's an official term, they become preliminary maps. And so this is the time frame. By the time that effective date, the new map effective date comes around, we want to make sure all of our towns have gone through the discussion of updating your bylaws. But as a lot of you know, because I know there's a lot of planning commission folks here, that it also may mean that you need to update your town plans. I know in NRPC that they're constantly working with all of you to make sure that there's never a town plan that lapses. So I think everyone's going to be in good shape with that. But there's kind of the town plan process. Make sure your town plan's being updated and on track to be effective, and then we can work, talk about municipal bylaws and flood hazard regulations. So again, this projected deadline for updating the bylaws will be somewhere around summer 2025. And that timeline can shift, that the work map meeting, the one this spring gets pushed back, then everything kind of gets pushed back. And that correction time frame, maybe a community may appeal the maps, do a formal appeal that may push it back. FEMA may need more time to make a bigger update. There's a big correction that needs to be made. So this is very fluid, but that's what we're shooting for at this time frame, summer 2025. So in Franklin County and in Grand Isle, these zones, these approximate floodplains, FEMA is going to be using a much newer process called base level engineering that's going to produce some much better quality flood zones than what you're probably used to. So not just not having them on paper, but the actual flood map and the floodplain that's drawn is going to be much better. I'll show a picture of what that's going to look like. They're going to take some of the old flood studies, maybe where they may not be updating the flood studies, but they're going to redelineate them. It means that they're going to take that floodplain that's drawn on the map and they're going to use new 1-foot contours. There's statewide LiDAR where we have ground elevations, and they're going to use those to make the new edges of the floodplain. So they should be a lot better at helping you understand what parts of your community are in or out of the floodplain, the FEMA map floodplain. And we are going to have some updates. The big updates in our area is the Missisquoi. That was the big restudy. The Trout, I think the Tyler Branch, and that area, the Lamoille in the southern part. That's like Fletcher in Georgia down there. So this is an example. This is kind of like the blobby zone A that you may see on your paper. You know, this is kind of what it looks like on your paper maps today. And then with the new base level engineering that FEMA's doing, their new process, it's going to create a flood map that's actually resembling something on the ground. It's actually going to look like a floodplain, you know, and not just a blob that goes up hillsides or something like that. So when they're updating the maps, they're going to be looking at river gauges to get an understanding of past flood events. Sometimes we have flood events that exceed, you know, the type of flood that they're trying to map. You know, in this example, this I think was in Northfield, where Irene was a pretty big event there. And you can see like what they're mapping is actually not as big of a flood as something like Irene or the 27 flood. So they're going to be looking at what are past flood events, how do we expect the river and the streams to flood in the future. So when we look at streams in Vermont, we're looking at FEMA's special flood hazard area, kind of represented by this hashed line zone. But we also encourage communities to look at river corridors. This is a setback that's meant more for the potential for the stream to move over time. We see streams move a lot. Any of our mountain towns, you know, Montgomery for sure, Enosburg, we see a lot of the streams moving over time. You know, there's water coming out of the steep mountains, and that water moves fast. So during a larger flood event, it has the tendency for streams to erode, and the stream moves over time. And so when we talk with towns, you know, we encourage them to consider not just where the water gets up high and floods on the big flat floodplain, but where do we have the potential for streams to move? So we call this kind of protection of a floodplain area and protection of river corridors, that area where the streams may move, as like a no adverse impact. We don't want to have an impact on our existing development or neighbors who are already living in the floodplain, you know, basically by allowing new floodplain development, we don't want to have them adversely impacting the people who are already there. So our model recommendation, our bylaw models, we have models you can start from. It's not like you have to invent everything from scratch. We'll work with the Regional Planning Commission folks, so Greta and the other planners there at NRPC, to get a sense of what a town is looking for. As you update bylaws, you know, a lot of the region's bylaws have been updated relatively recently. So we're in pretty good shape. It might be a little bit more of like revisiting the conversation. Do we want to look at more protective floodplain regulations, so protecting development to a higher standard, or do we want to consider river corridors, again, protecting areas where rivers may move? You know, I know tonight a lot of folks from the islands are here, where we don't really have many, if any, drawn river corridors. I'll talk a little bit more about river corridors, but in Franklin County, that may be a bigger consideration for your town. So our model regulations are looking at, again, at that FEMA high water. How do we protect and consider development in areas where the water is going to get high? And what do we do to protect development where the streams may move, and addressing erosion risks? I just checked. Okay, 6:30. We're doing good. So in general, our recommended models, you know, they're designed, we have kind of two versions. One can kind of get placed as an appendix at the end of your bylaws. It's kind of like a standalone, we call it a standalone model. It has all the pieces in one place. And then we have another model where it's kind of divided up. So if you have existing zoning, We have an administration section that can just kind of get placed in your existing administration section. We have definitions that can just get placed where your definitions are. So we have different ways to approach it. I think the big highlights of what our model talks about is within that river corridor, that area where the river may move, where the risk is not water getting high, but the risk is that the river moves and the riverbank is gone. We're trying not to build any new development closer to the river where it might be more at risk than what's already there. In FEMA's special flood hazard area, again, that inundation floodplain, we recommend not allowing new fill. When you place fill, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but placing fill in floodplains can have an adverse impact on people who are already in the floodplain. And then for a development that is located in that FEMA floodplain, making sure we're elevating higher than the minimum that FEMA recommends to make sure that people are safe, and also to try to account for climate change and change in the weather and flooding that we've seen. So we kind of think of it as protecting both of these flood risks, protecting from the inundation flood risk and protecting from the potential for the river to move. Yeah, in this example here, we see some parts of that, the river system, like sometimes you're more at risk of inundation flooding. So the bigger concern is like elevating existing buildings, trying to keep new fill away from that area. But then you have other places where there's not as much of a chance of the river flooding the floodplain, but there may be a greater risk of the river moving. And so it's kind of like two different ways of looking at flood risk. So in that FEMA floodplain, these are kind of getting a little bit more into the weeds, but I think the biggest thing is that we're looking to have structures elevated 2 feet above FEMA's flood height. That's kind of the big story, the main story, and to look at, again, not trying to pass risk onto people who are already in the floodplain. So not allowing for new fill, or ensuring that any new development or fill is not going to have an adverse impact on existing development. So this, we use a kind of a technique called compensatory storage. The idea is that if new fill is added in a floodplain, if this is an option your town can consider, if you are adding new fill in the floodplain, that you're compensating, you're offsetting, you're creating an equal amount of flood storage. So you fill some part of your floodplain, but you're creating new flood storage so that you're not passing your flood risk to your neighbor. Because if you put, oops, I'm missing my slide that shows if you add new fill in a floodplain and the water comes up and floods this land, then you're gonna push that water that would normally occupy that floodplain to your neighbor. So sometimes you think about the Lake Champlain floodplain. We talked about this a lot with different residents along the lake after 2011. You fill a little bit of that floodplain, that's not going to raise the lake, the lake floodplain level. But what it may do is divert your water that used to be on part of your property to your neighbor's property. So if they're not elevated and they're not protected, their flooding may be worse, or it may make the water more erosive. The waves may be more erosive for your neighbors. So there's always an impact when you add new fill, or you harden your lakeshore, or you add riprap to your riverbank. So a river corridor, again, it's that area that we're trying to keep new development out of, that allows that river to move without worrying about someone's house falling into the river. And so that river corridor is allowing room for that process of that river to move to happen without putting someone in the way. And so the big approach, the big thing to keep in mind from a river corridor standpoint is, again, we have a lot of existing small villages that are on rivers. We're not going to pick the entire village up and move it. We're just trying to keep the new development from getting closer, trying to keep people from being at risk. And then when we have other parts of our community where there really isn't a lot of development in and near a river, we're trying to keep that area open. Again, so we see in this example, like the river is adjusting and moving. It floods part of that area. Maybe it moves a little further over time, one way or another. And we're just trying to keep new houses and development away from that process, so we don't have to worry. And 2 o'clock in the morning on site trying to pull someone's house or get people out of a house where the back of their property, up against the river, is falling into the river in the middle of the flood. Oh, here's my slide that it was out of order. I apologize. Just talking about, again, adding fill and how that makes the flood levels higher for neighboring development. And this is kind of that, again, that idea of the river corridor. Seeing it sometimes can be helpful. You know, you have a house that's in near the river channel. You know, maybe their feet get wet, maybe they don't, maybe they're elevated up on fill, their feet don't get wet, doesn't get wet because they're up on fill. Over time, the river is going to adjust and move. So it may get deeper and make that riverbank steeper and more likely to fall in. It may widen and adjust, again, having the potential for that house to be at risk of falling in during a flood. Ooh, I'm gonna go through these. So when we look to protect houses and development in our town for public safety and property protection, you know, we're also helping to protect floodplain functions. We're trying to protect the water quality of Lake Champlain. We're trying to protect those areas in our community that are good for fish and wildlife and habitat. So we can achieve all of those things by avoiding development in the floodplain, new development in the floodplain, and avoid having impacts to neighboring and existing development. So some of the resources that we have that can be helpful along the way, we have a few websites. We have one called Flood Ready. We have a lot of information there about some of the benefits that towns can receive if you take kind of an avoidance approach to your floodplain regulations. One of them is the Vermont Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, ERAF. When there is any sort of federal declaration, we just had one for the storms in December, right around Christmas time, for up in our region. There's a federal disaster declaration of some sort. The state reimburses towns on some level for the public damages. So that's damages to roads, damages to public buildings. FEMA reimburses towns typically as 75% of those costs, and there's an additional 25% that's the local responsibility. And so the state of Vermont cost share how much of that local responsibility the state will pay for, depending on how many different mitigation actions, kind of preparedness actions a community may take. Oh. Oops. Like we don't, there we go. So with ERAF, an example, if a community has $1 million in recovery costs after that flood event from roads being, usually it's roads, bridges, culverts that are impacted, maybe public buildings as well. In an example where a community has not taken any mitigation actions, that local cost share, how much the local community has to pay for it, they're going to be paying for most of that local share. So FEMA is going to be covering 75% of the costs. The state will pick up 7.5%. So the town may be on the hook for around $175,000. If the town is in the National Flood Insurance Program and they've adopted some other elements, local emergency operations plan, hazard mitigation plan, they have road and bridge standards in place, then the state picks up, we kind of split that remaining local share. If a town has done those things, but they also have river corridor protections, then the state will cover the majority of the local share, 17.5% of the local share. So you can see the difference in an event of how much a community may be able to save by having more protective flood hazard regulations. On that Flood Ready site, we also have community reports. You can learn kind of where your community is at with Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, ERAF, and some other information about the date of your plans, things like that. We also, this is kind of a summary of some of the different links. I'm going to share these in the chat when we're done. But we also have a website called floodtraining.vt.gov where we have information about the map update process, about that FEMA map update process. We have links to our model regulations. Greta and the NRPC team will have copies of those and be able to work with you to look at what you want to be adopting. And we have a bunch of some different informational handouts that can be helpful. And again, I'll put those links in the chat at the end of this. I'm gonna skip over I'll go through this quickly. I don't want to go too long because what time is it? 6:37. So I don't want to keep you on for too long, everyone. But again, you can check your community reports at Flood Ready. The biggest thing is updating your municipal plan. I think, when we spoke with the folks at NRPC, I think that everyone's on track to make sure that their town plans never lapse. So I don't think this should be a big issue here. And so one of the things in the process of updating the flood regulations in your community is making sure the planning commission is communicating with the select board. So the select board's aware that this process may be going on, the planning commission's aware, and they have some agreement or understanding of what direction the planning commission should take as they're working on drafting flood regulations for the select board to consider and for public meetings. And then one of the things that we encourage our towns to do is to think of an inclusive way of trying to get as many people involved in the conversation as possible, which is usually a pretty big task. It's a hard task to achieve because a lot of people don't want to be in a night meeting at 7:30 at night while their families are there or dinner is on the table. So trying to think of creative or different ways to engage your community. Maybe they can't be at a public meeting, but maybe there's ways that you could use Front Porch Forum to get feedback or to do like a poll or a survey that's sent out to folks in your town to get a sense of what people are in support of or what they may think about for a direction for the community to consider. When we are working on drafts, the folks at NRPC will coordinate with our office to make sure that any draft that you have is going to be minimally FEMA compliant. That we're going to be able to check the box to FEMA to say this town has a flood hazard regulations that are compliant and they're ready to go for those new maps to become effective. And they'll basically, we're starting that process now with FEMA for towns that we know they're already there. They already have compliant bylaws. We're starting to pass those on to FEMA now for their review. And so again, that prep deadline of spring, summer of 2025 is kind of what we're aiming for. So even though 2 years seems like it's a ways away, time goes quickly, especially when the summer, the planning commission's not meeting, everyone's on vacation, and then it's fall and winter start doing some work, and then it's town meeting day, and then something else comes up, and all of a sudden your time is slipping by quickly. So we encourage towns, especially if you're looking to have a conversation with residents in the town or to really kind of promote some public education of what this process is, to start early and get the word out. And so for engaging your community, some of the questions that we like planning commissions and select boards to consider: who's most at risk? Are they there? And if they're not there, how can you try to make sure that you're considering them in the policies and regulations you're considering? And how can you prioritize different protection measures to try and reduce harm as best as we can? So I think with that, that's kind of the summary I just said. And here's again one of the links. We have like a shorthand handout with a lot of this information that you can take with you. So I'll send that link, kind of getting ready for the new FEMA maps. I'll send that link in the chat. Greta, I think, is the lead contact at NRPC, but I know you and a few of the other planners are all working on this. Ned Swanberg, my colleague. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, just you can introduce Ned first, and then I will just follow up with sort of some of the work we are doing.
Perfect. Okay. Ned Swanberg, my colleague, he's kind of taking charge of managing this process across the state. So although I'm the floodplain manager for up in this region, you may end up working quite a bit with Ned as you're looking at draft options and kind of going back and forth on, is this FEMA compliant or not? And what does this draft have in it? So I'll turn to you, Greta.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to let everyone know right now that NRPC staff, Mike Johnston and Emily Cloft and myself are working on reviewing everyone's bylaws right now, every town in our region. So every town in Grand Isle County and every town in Franklin County against the minimum requirements for the NFIP. And so that's something that we're doing under contract with ANR through another regional planning commission. And so that's the beginning work for us to be able to get a feel for which communities are going to need to do some either minor updates or larger updates in the next year or two to ensure that their bylaws are in compliance with the standards. And when we do reach out to you in the coming months, that will be an opportunity to talk about, okay, well, what are the changes that you might need that are just some minor wordsmithing to make sure that you're meeting those very strict FEMA standards, but that will also be an opportunity for us to have a discussion about river corridors or other types of standards that might get you a better ERAF rate, as Rebecca was talking about too. So you may want to, if you're going to open up the bylaws, your flood hazard bylaws, go beyond just what the minimum standards might be for the NFIP and make a few additional changes. And then I did just want to note with North Hero, I don't know if we have any select board members there or if the planning commission knows exactly where the bylaws stand in terms of going for a municipal vote, but I do have that review completed and we're working on compiling. We need to still send that bylaw to DEC for that final review, and we will be in touch with you very shortly with what those changes are, and I'll set up a meeting with you. And if you can incorporate any of those changes into your bylaw that is currently draft and going to be put to the voters, then you will be all set and that will be done. And for communities that do send their bylaws to the voters, now, that would be a great thing to have completed, because that can be a bigger process than when the select board adopts it.
And I have one last plug before we open it up for questions or anything. In 2 weeks, April 18th to April 21st, we're going to be holding a 4-day FEMA class. It's kind of like an introductory floodplain manager class. It's going to be in Waterbury at the state office complex there. And it's free for anyone to attend. And it's 4 full days. It's 8:30 to 4:30, or 9 to 4:30, which I know can be quite a commitment. But if anyone's interested in that additional training on the flood insurance program, reading flood maps, administering flood regulations, anything like that, then I encourage you can contact me for more information. I'm going to put a link here in the chat if you'd like to register for the class. Again, it's free. It's April 18th through April 21st at the Waterbury State Office Complex.
Thanks, Rebecca. And then I see Lisa, do you have a question?
I do have a question. This is following up to Emily Clark's question in the chat. She was wondering how these regulations worked with Shoreline Protection Act. And my question is, you've talked a lot about floodplains, but what about lake level rising just in general and seawall protection?
Great question. Yeah, so the lake level is an interesting one, because I feel like what we've seen for the past several years, and what I think has been some of the trend is higher lake levels in the spring, for sure. And then, but then in the summer, having more of that drought. And I don't know how much of that is just like a decade trend. But it seems like the lake level fluctuates much more than it has in the past. You know, like you see people's docks stranded in the mud in the middle of June or July, or in July and August. But then in the springtime, we're definitely seeing a lot more kind of higher lake levels during the melt off. It's a great question. I think the same kind of conversation around river corridors is similar with, I think, lakeshore development. FEMA, like in the Great Lakes, they map the Great Lakes almost as like an ocean, where they're looking at waves, wave action, the potential for waves to come up onto shore and create erosion and damage. So having setbacks from where those waves may land. They haven't mapped Lake Champlain in that way. I don't know if they will. Maybe at some point in the future, but I think in 2011, I think everyone saw the damage that waves can create during when the lake level is high. It was incredible. In South here, I remember roads at like, 107, 108 being washed out from behind from the waves going over, those south facing roads, and it was incredible. I mean, the causeway, Isle Lamont was stranded almost. So I think one of the things that we've talked to, and actually on the islands, a lot of our islands towns they took that seriously. And post 2011, I think all of the island towns have at least 1 or 2 feet of freeboard, so having development elevated higher. And a lot of towns have also implemented some level of shoreline protection, beyond the state shoreline protection rules, setbacks, things like that. So we don't have like specific floodplain models. We've worked on some lakeshore language, kind of more protective lakeshore language, but I think it'll probably be a little bit more seeing what towns may already have and how do we integrate any sort of flood regulations to help protect from the lake hazards. Because seawalls are similar to riprap on rivers. If you riprap and armor the bank of a river, that part of the river may not erode, but you're passing that energy, the power of that river to your neighbor downstream. And, on the islands, on the lake with waves, it's a similar process. When you put up a seawall, you're putting the seawall up and then you may see your neighbor's property start to go at a quicker rate. And so thinking about how do we protect shorelands and riverbanks in a way that helps to kind of slow waves down, dissipate that wave energy. I think all of those are things that we would love to have that conversation in your town with you.
And then in terms of coordination with the shoreline protection regulations, I think that there's 2 sets of regulations that in some cases overlap, but it's, each standard of the shoreline protection regs is applied for, and through that particular agency, your local development review board will apply your flood hazard regulations. In some cases, land will be subject to both. But all standard, there's no other real coordination, but they're relative to each other and work together when all of the standards are applied.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Greta. The state applies shoreline regulations. You're looking at flood regulations at the town level. One of the things that may help some of that coordination is that our floodplain managers, so me for right now in Franklin and Grand Isle, we're looking to bring a new person on to cover our region. We're available to help with technical assistance on issuing your local floodplain permit. So you have a project come in, there's a statute that says you pass it to the Agency of Natural Resources. We have a 30-day review and comment period before the permit can be issued. And so the intent of it is not that, the intent is that we're there to help you figure out what needs to be done to make sure your permit is meeting the flood hazard standards in your bylaw. And so in that process, whether it's me or if it's the new person who will be hopefully hired soon, so you'll actually have someone who will be able to be more responsive to you. then they'll be able to talk to Laura Woods, who's the, you know, the A&R person doing shoreline protection rules. So we can try to coordinate that review. She's pretty, you know, the Lakeshore folks are trying to be pretty coordinated and saying like, this is what we need to do. Sometimes things may not always, you know, one leads the other, but we try to stay in good contact.
Awesome.
And,
Thanks for stressing that. Andy.
Yeah, a couple of questions. First of all, you know, North Hero, we're obviously really just concerned with Lake Champlain. The current flood hazard overlay district is below elevation 102. I assume that's not changing. In other words, elevation 102 is still the flood elevation for Lake Champlain.
Essentially, yes, it's not going up. It'll be the same. I mean, there's, yeah, by like tenths of a foot, it'll be, but 102 is a good, the same
Okay.
shorthand that we'll still use.
And will the new flood maps, can you overlay those with the existing flood maps to see what areas may or may not be in different flood zones?
Yeah, we have done it in the past where we have our paper maps like in Franklin and Grand Isle counties. We try to do kind of like a best guess estimate. I have a feeling that for most of the islands, there may not be a ton of change because most of your floodplain, like in North Hero, almost all of your floodplain is Lake Champlain.
Right.
And there's a few of those like wetland areas that may come up into the town, you know, from the lake. And so those may stay relatively similar or the same. The delineation, like the edges may be better defined, but I don't imagine that there's going to be like wholesale new parts of town that are newly mapped. In Franklin County, it may be a little bit different in different parts of the town, but I think in the islands, it probably won't be too much of a surprise.
Okay, thank you. And one final question for Greta, and I appreciate the fact that you're expediting the review of our regulations since we are getting ready for a vote. What happens if the vote, what if the regulation updates gets voted down? And I guess that's a question, you know, anytime we update our regulations, it has to be approved by the voters. And I assume that's the case even with the flood regulations. So my question is, what happens if it gets voted down?
So I think let's answer that question specific to what happens if you then don't have flood hazard regulations that are compliant with FEMA. And I'll let Rebecca answer that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can, so FEMA comes out with their draft maps. We get a chance to look at them. Then they come out with the official preliminary maps. And at that point, that kicks off, like we know the maps will become effective 6 months from that date that they are officially preliminary. So we have that date in hand. We know 6 months ahead of time exactly the date that those maps become effective. The town will have to have compliant flood hazard bylaws. And that's the one time where FEMA will just like automatically suspend a town from the National Flood Insurance Program. So I'll go kind of down two routes. I'll go down the route. If you don't have compliant bylaws on that date, which I hope that will not happen to anyone, then you're immediately suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program. That means that flood insurance policies are not able to be written or renewed in your community during that time. If that was to happen, that could be a big deal for people who have flood insurance policies. And the reason why I think a lot of you may be aware of this, I didn't want to go too far into the weeds of it, but flood insurance becomes essential if you have a home equity loan or if you have a mortgage, any sort of federally backed loan where your house is your collateral essentially. So you have an FDIC insured bank loan for your mortgage or a loan. If you're located in FEMA's mapped floodplain, you have to have flood insurance on for that loan to stay current. So that becomes a big deal in that way. Hopefully again, that no one's going to get to that point. One of the things I think, Andy, like leading up to that, because the voters have to approve regulations, we've seen some towns get tripped up on, it could be because the entire zoning bylaw is going before the voters. And so they may not even care about the flood regs, but they're really focused on this thing. It's really controversial. We, we always could look to separate the flood regulations from the rest of the bylaw and go to vote that way. I'm not sure, Greta, if like, I don't know the legality of this. I know that there's provisions to have like, and I don't know if this works with Australian ballot or not, but if you can have like a, for 3 years, you can have like a, why is my brain blanking? When you can adopt your bylaws like on you have it, Brett, I think.
An interim bylaw.
Thank you. It's like
Sorry,
my brain is blocked.
Unmuting
You can
myself.
adopt maybe possibly an interim bylaw. And when we had the southern counties that kind of went through this process back in the mid 2000s, when they got digital maps for the first time, we did have like 2 or 3 towns that adopted their flood bylaws in an interim basis to get them through the hump of the map effective date, and then went through and did the more formal full process at a later date. But they had the interim bylaws in place at the time.
Right. So luckily, Andy
Thank
and other North Hero folks, you know, you're going to have time, if I really hope your bylaw will pass, but if in the worst case scenario that it doesn't, you have time to regroup and
Sure.
still figure out how to make sure that you have compliant flood hazard regulations by the deadline.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
Emily Clark has a question in the chat. Any guidance or templates on new and existing septic systems relative to the shoreline or floodplain proximity?
Thank you. I saw that before, and thank you. In our model regulations, we do have language for septic systems, more that it's kind of like a best fit situation. So a lot of our language is about not allowing for new fill in floodplains because of the potential impact on neighboring properties. One of the exceptions, again, not to like, I don't want to dig too much into the weeds, but one of the exceptions we do right in there is for best fit septic systems, because you don't want to condemn a house for not being able to put like an above ground mound system in if it's needed. We don't get into the actual regulation of the system itself because none of our towns are none of our towns are designated towns. The only town I know of is Colchester and Charlotte, I think, where they actually do the septic system permitting. Ooh, Greta, yeah, okay. So the flood bylaws don't get into the actual like management and permitting of the system itself and like how it functions. The state rules do have language in there to ensure that the system is designed considering that it's in a floodplain, if it is. And so, making sure that it's designed that it's not going to overflow during a flood event and that you have enough capacity in your tank or storage that it's not going to, again, trying to be pumping into a flooded field, that kind of thing. So there are standards that meet FEMA's minimum standards in the state on-site regulations. And so what the town is regulating is the development around the building of the site of the system, while the state's regulating how the system works, if that makes sense. I don't know if that fully answers your question, Emily, or not.
Yeah, Emily doesn't have volume, so yes, thanks, she says. Okay, great. Great. Any other questions?
This is Lisa Faring. And so you were talking about payouts during federal disaster assistance. And you're specifically talking about, the percentages of restitution to towns for roads. Does any of this affect private property, private roads? In terms of like the insurance or?
Yeah, so again, not to keep you here until 8:30. It's kind of like the abridged version of the flood insurance. I can talk for hours about this stuff. I'm sure you will all be riveted for all that time. So the flood insurance program started back in the late 60s, early 70s. And the idea was that because people couldn't buy flood insurance anymore, it was too expensive because the only people who bought flood insurance were people who got flooded. And so if you're always getting flooded, insurance doesn't really work as a good mechanism to offset your losses. And so the federal government stepped in, essentially saying, we need some mechanism here. So the agreement was that the federal government would make flood insurance available to communities that join the National Flood Insurance Program. And when the community agrees to join the National Flood Insurance Program, you're agreeing to regulate all development in your FEMA mapped floodplain. So all development is what it sounds like, all development. It's like human changes to the land and real estate changes to buildings, filling, grading, paving, new structures, all sorts of things, basically covering any sort of changes to the land that occur in that FEMA mapped floodplain. And so I kind of blew through the ERAF stuff because I didn't want to go too far down like into that and take up a ton of time. But Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund is tied to your local floodplain regulations. So your local floodplain regulations are regulating town roads and bridges. They're regulating individual people's homes if they're in a FEMA floodplain. They're regulating any development they may do, filling the property, building new houses, that kind of thing. Putting up a seawall, that kind of stuff. The ERAF, Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, comes into play. So the town's going along, someone's coming in, they get their flood hazard permit, they get their zoning permit, and then another 2011 spring flood hits. And then all of a sudden the town roads are washed out, roads and bridges are washed out. In that, if there's a federal emergency declaration for that flood, FEMA reimburses the town for the public damages, the damages to your roads and bridges to help rebuild them, because they're basically acknowledging that the cost of that is so great the towns aren't able to bear those costs on their own. FEMA reimburses the cost of the damage, 75% of that cost. So that additional 25% of damages to your public road and infrastructure system is basically on the town to cover. And so Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, the state's program, tries to pick up more of that local cost. The more that a town has done to offset potential losses by having more protective floodplain regulations, having your local hazard mitigation plan. And so the more a town does, the more the state kicks in that local cost share. To be honest, in the islands, the adoption of river corridor standards in many cases may be pretty easy because it's a matter of essentially doing, in a lot of cases, it might be like a 50-foot setback from small, because a lot of them are all small streams and rivers. I think there's no drainage larger than 2 square miles in the islands. So it's essentially like a 50-foot setback from top of bank or top of slope of the small streams and rivers that there are. So in the islands, that can be an easy thing to do. In the rest of our towns in Franklin County, then we can look at that town, with the planning commission, with select board to look at what that impact may be for river corridors. So if towns adopt river corridors, the state's kicking in 75% or 75% of your local match, essentially. The state's picking up 75% of your local match for those public damages. So it's kind of like the connection is like the floodplain regulations are there all the time, over like regulating development all the time, fair weather, rainy weather. The Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund comes in during those large declarations when you have lots of public damages.
Right. So I was really wondering more about, we've got a lot of private infrastructure that is, private roads particularly, and many of those are probably not going to be in the floodplain. But if there was a significant flood event, they would be affected. They wouldn't have flood insurance. And so what happens to handle those events?
I see. I gotcha. In many cases, just like you said, they're not eligible for flood insurance on like roads and infrastructure. In most cases, when private roads wash out, it's up to the owners of that private road to rebuild it. There sometimes may be some different funding sources that may be available depending on the type of flood it may be, how big it might be. There's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. They're part of the USDA the US Department of Agriculture. They have a program called like Emergency Watershed Protection, where they may cover some of those damages. But in most cases, the private roads are borne by the owners of the private road, like the cost to repair private roads are borne by the owners of the private road.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Rebecca? Before we give you just some closing highlights and say goodnight. All right. One of the things, just to highlight a few things, Rebecca, I wanted to just make sure that everyone was aware that we will be reaching out to each planning commission within the next several months to start talking about the status of your floodplain regulations. But then also my understanding is that when FEMA is ready to schedule when they do schedule the work map meeting, that there may not be a lot of lead time between when the state of Vermont, when Rebecca knows what it is, when she tells us when it is, so we will do our best to get the word out and make everyone aware of when that is. But I would just we're going to try to get the word out now that, hey, it's coming. So just stay tuned for that information, because there may not be a whole lot of lead time, like a few weeks potentially, Rebecca. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's about right. Probably. I feel like we've maybe gotten like 2 weeks lead time, 2-3 weeks, maybe lead time.
And so that, yeah, so I just wanted to use this opportunity to make sure that everyone we can sort of stay tuned to this information, this topic, so we can make sure to get the word out and have good attendance at those meetings. This recording will be posted on the website, our NRPC's website, so that if there are additional members of your town boards that should be viewing this, you can access that and share it. And then, as always, if you have any questions about any of the content tonight, please do not hesitate to contact me, Mike Johnston, Rebecca, and in the chat, Rebecca has pasted or copied and pasted in the websites that the state of Vermont is maintaining on this map update process as well. So, Rebecca, I want to thank you for spending the time tonight to speak with board members from our region. It was really helpful and I really appreciate it. Rebecca just put the contact information for both Ned and herself in the chat as well. And so thank you, Rebecca. And thanks everyone else for attending tonight. We're slowly losing people.
I know. I really want to thank everyone for sticking around. I thank you for giving up your night, and thank you for all the work you do for your towns, because it's all volunteer work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Night.